Hey guys, tonight we slip into the smoke-filled glow of a world without shiny kitchens, without stainless steel fridges humming in the corner, without even a reliable match to strike. You're going to wander into the Middle Ages, where meals didn't rise from microwaves, but from open flames, stone hearths, and some surprisingly ingenious tricks. Picture yourself stepping into a drafty hall where the fire is so smoky your eyes water before you've even said grace. And remember, without the comfort of modern ventilation, you probably won't survive this dinner. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and the local time in the comments. It's fun to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've been told 1,000 times in school books and TV shows that medieval kitchens were vast stone ovens where hearty meals roasted daily like in a castle banquet. But the truth smolders very differently once you walk closer to the fire. Imagine yourself ducking inside a timber-framed house where the ceiling is low and soot-stained, and instead of a neat tiled oven, you find a central fire pit, the smoke escaping through nothing more than a hole in the roof. Your cloak stinks after only 5 minutes inside. The myth of gleaming, permanent kitchens is laughable, almost like believing every modern home hides a 5-star restaurant. One joke that would have landed even back then: "Welcome to our kitchen. Oh wait, that's just the fireplace." In reality, cooking spaces were makeshift, often nothing more than smoky huts, or even outdoors in summer, because too much fire inside meant disaster. The mainstream fact is that only wealthy castles and monasteries could afford dedicated stone kitchens with chimneys. Most villagers relied on open hearths, the quirky tidbit. Some towns had communal bake ovens. Picture everyone lining up with dough under their arms, grumbling about the neighbor's bread-hogging space. And historians still argue whether the lack of chimneys was a design flaw or a deliberate choice to keep smoke curing the meat hanging from rafters. As you squint in the haze, you catch the mini-pav of a scrawny boy fanning coals for his mother, coughing dramatically while secretly hoping dinner will taste less like campfire. By now, you can smell the smoke in your hair, the bread warming on a stone, and you start to understand why medieval people looked forward to feasts. They were the only time the food tasted less like chimney sweep. Another quick laugh. Imagine trying to sell smoke-flavored bread at a modern bakery. It'd be on clearance in minutes. The punchline lands as you realize your medieval dream kitchen is just a smoky shack where dinner and laundry share the same air. And if you complain about a broken exhaust fan today, remember that your ancestors' only ventilation system was hoping the wind was on their side. Call back to our start. You definitely wouldn't survive this dinner, but at least you'd never need scented candles. And just as you settle in with watery eyes, you know the myths are only getting smokier from here. You've always pictured medieval folks piling their tables high, gobbling turkey legs every evening like extras in a costume drama, right? The myth says everyone feasted daily, like kings, a rolling banquet of meats, breads, and goblets overflowing. You can almost hear the background lute player strumming a soundtrack to endless luxury. But flip the table, and you see a very different truth. Most people survived on porridge, so plain it would make modern oatmeal taste like dessert. If breakfast was a thin gruel of barley or oats, lunch wasn't much better. Just more grain, with maybe a splash of milk, if the cow cooperated that morning. Dinner. Same thing, just reheated, and slightly thicker. Joke number 1 comes early. If variety is the spice of life, the medieval peasant's menu was basically life without spices. The mainstream fact: peasants lived mostly on cereals and legumes. Bread, when available, and only on special occasions would meat or cheese appear. And here's the quirky tidbit: you might find a fish pie on a random Wednesday. Not because it was fancy, but because church rules made meat forbidden on so many days you lost track, so fish filled the gaps. Historians still argue whether peasants were perpetually hungry or simply accustomed to monotony, since archaeological bone studies show surprisingly sturdy health despite the dull menus. Through the smoky haze of Section 1, imagine shifting POV now into a peasant mother ladling thin stew into wooden bowls, her children slurping it down like it's the best feast they'll ever get. She glances at you, half grinning, as if to say, "At least nobody's fighting over turkey legs here." By the middle of this story, your stomach is rumbling not from hunger, but from the absurdity of thinking medieval villagers were nightly kings. Remember the callback? In smoky kitchens, the only banquet was coughing fits, not roast swan. And here's joke number 2. If peasants could time travel, they'd probably faint in front of a supermarket cereal. All wait, all this porridge comes in flavors. Proof piles up, not in silk-draped halls, but in humble homes where banquet meant a slightly thicker gruel than yesterday's. The punchline lands when you realize the true luxury was not the feast, but simply not eating the exact same thing 3 times a day. Another joke before you drift off deeper: peasants didn't ask what's for dinner. They asked, how watery is it tonight? By the time you picture the last spoon scraping the bowl, you see the bigger truth: only kings and lords held nightly banquets. While everyone else prayed the porridge wouldn't burn at the hearth. So next time you reheat leftovers, smile, you're keeping an authentic medieval tradition alive. Somewhere between your own midnight snack cravings and the cozy fog of sleep, you've probably imagined medieval food as gray, flavorless mush, right? The myth says everything tasted bland and boring, like chewing cardboard with a hint of wood smoke. You picture peasants hunched over bowls, sighing as if their taste buds had taken a vow of silence. But here's the twist: spices were the medieval obsession, worth more than gold, and kitchens smelled less like wet hay and more like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper drifting through the rafters. Think of it as medieval DoorDash, except the delivery time from the East took months, and you definitely paid surge pricing. First joke arrives right here. Peppercorns were so valuable, landlords sometimes accepted them as rent. Imagine trying that at your modern apartment office. Hey, my rent's late, but here's half a teaspoon of black pepper. The mainstream fact: spices like pepper, saffron, cinnamon, and cloves flowed along trade routes from Asia, and they weren't just for nobles. They trickled down to the merchant classes too. Quirky tidbit: medieval cooks sometimes overseasoned food with spices, not to hide rot, as TV loves to claim, but to show off wealth. Dousing meat in saffron was like driving a Lamborghini. Historians still argue whether ordinary townsfolk truly had access to spices, or if most accounts reflect the lives of elites. Pottery shards with spice residue hint that more than just kings had flavorful meals. Slip into a mini-pav now, a merchant's wife stirring a pot, sneaking a pinch of saffron, grinning because she knows the neighbor will smell it through the window and gossip about their wealthy stew. As the scent swirls through your sleepy imagination, you get a callback from our earlier smoky huts. The poor might have been stuck with choking hearths, but the rich endured smoke clouds, seasoned with cloves and pepper, not just ashes. Joke number 2 slips in. Medieval spice blends were like Spotify playlists. Everyone claimed theirs was the perfect mix, but no one wanted to share the recipe. The proof keeps stacking. Manuscripts from noble households record spice quantities so huge that a year's worth could bankrupt small villages. And yet, spice was also medicine: ginger for the stomach, cinnamon for circulation. Historians debate whether people believed in its actual health effects or just loved the flavor. The line between doctor's order and chef's choice blurred deliciously. Now picture yourself at the banquet table, a platter of spiced venison steaming before you, and you lean in for a taste only to sneeze from the peppery cloud. Joke number 3 ties the knot. Medieval folks didn't ask, "Is it too salty?" They asked, "Do we need a fire extinguisher for this much pepper?" The punchline drifts softly. Far from bland, medieval cooking was a fireworks show of taste for those who could afford it. And just as you start drifting again, you realize the bland myth belongs more to our sleepy imaginations than to their smoky kitchens. You've seen enough movies to believe the only way medieval people cooked was by hanging pots over roaring bonfires, sparks flying, meat sizzling like some prehistoric barbecue. The myth paints every dinner like a night's feast cooked caveman style, flames licking dangerously close to eyebrows. But here's where the story flips. Sometimes fire wasn't the star of the show at all. Hot stones did the heavy lifting. Imagine soup bubbling gently because someone heated rocks in the fire and dropped them carefully into a clay pot of water. Suddenly, your medieval kitchen feels more like a camping hack video than a Hollywood set. Joke number 1 lands right here. Honey, dinner's ready as soon as I finish throwing rocks into it. The mainstream fact, hearth cooking with suspended pots, was common. Yes, but hot stones, earth ovens, and even clay domes were widespread techniques. Archaeological finds of scorched stones show they were intentionally cycled through fires, then dunked into liquid foods. The quirky tidbit: Vikings boiled entire meals in wooden troughs using only hot stones, no pot, just wood, soup, and rocks. Historians still argue whether this was a fallback method for peasants or a clever, everyday strategy to avoid burning down half the village. Slip into a mini-puv. A tired farmer carefully lowers a glowing stone into a pot, listening for the hiss as if it were music, then mutters, "That's the sound of dinner behaving." By the middle of this moment, you can feel the callback from our smoky huts earlier, sure. Some families endured choking fire pits, but others quietly relied on stones that left no smoke at all. Joke number 2 sneaks in. Medieval cooking instructions. Mustafin. Confusing. Step 1, collect rocks. Step 2, cook dinner. Step 3, explain why your soup tastes like gravel. Proof keeps simmering. Historical cookbooks describe slow-roasted meats sealed in clay and buried under coals, a method echoing earth ovens still used worldwide today. Scholars debate whether this stone and clay approach was regional tradition or just survival improvisation, but the result was unmistakably efficient. Picture yourself ladling broth that's still steaming hours later, your spoon clinking against a stone lurking at the bottom. The fireless trick means dinner without the smoke-induced tears of a hearth. Joke number 3 ties the knot. Imagine explaining to a modern chef that your secret ingredient is literally rocks on fire. The punchline drifts easy. Medieval cooking wasn't just pots over flames. It was ingenuity disguised as simplicity, proving that even in the sootiest ages, people knew how to keep soup hot without losing their eyebrows. If you've ever torn into a fresh bakery loaf, you probably imagine medieval bread the same way, soft, fluffy, rising high like a cloud, perfect for sopping up stew. The myth insists that bread was always just like our modern baguettes or sandwich slices, a warm hug in wheat form. Flip the thought, though, and suddenly bread becomes something sturdier, heavier, and sometimes even a plate. Yes, you heard that right. Loaves doubled as dinnerware, called trenchers. Instead of washing dishes, you simply ate them, soggy, stew and all. Joke number 1 lands quickly. Dishwasher broken. No problem. Just serve soup on a slice of yesterday's bread. The mainstream fact is that medieval bread came in many forms, from fine white loaves reserved for elites to dense rye or barley bread eaten by the poor. The quirky tidbit is trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread used as edible plates, which soaked up gravies and were either eaten or tossed to the poor afterward. Historians still argue whether trenchers were widespread among all classes or mostly a noble trick, since archaeological crumbs and descriptions suggest multiple traditions. Imagine a mini-poff here, a servant sighs as he slaps down a crusty square in front of you, muttering, "Dinnerware, more like chewware." By the middle of this bite, you recall the callback to porridge and gruel if peasants were tired of watery stew. At least bread trenchers gave them something solid to gnaw on. Joke number 2 slips in. Bread bowls, because spoons are overrated and bowls are too expensive. Proof continues to pile up. Famine years forced bakers to stretch flour with peas, beans, or even acorns, making loaves so dense you'd need serious jaw muscles. Historians debate whether this adulterated bread was a survival tactic or a shady way for bakers to cut corners, since regulations tried and failed to keep bread pure. Picture yourself tearing into a trencher, soaked in greasy stew, the bottom layer practically a sponge. It tastes earthy, chewy, and nothing like the soft loaves you know. Joke number 3 anchors it. If you've ever said, "I'm too lazy to do dishes tonight," congratulations, you just found your medieval spirit animal. The punchline rests heavy, like the bread itself, far from always being fluffy comfort. Medieval bread could be plate, famine food, or even punishment for the jaws. And as you drift with the thought, you realize medieval people might laugh at our sliced bread worship, they'd argue. The greatest invention was not slicing bread, but using it to skip washing up. You probably imagine medieval villagers carving into fresh meat daily, like some endless feast where chickens, sheep, and cows were always sizzling over the fire. The myth paints a carnivore's paradise, where every day was Thanksgiving minus the awkward family debates. But here's the truth. Meat was precious, and people preserved it for months through salting, pickling, smoking, and drying. Fresh meat was rare outside noble banquets. For the average household, an autumn slaughter of a cow or a few chickens had to stretch across the cold months, and every bite was carefully rationed. Joke number 1 slips in. If medieval refrigerators existed, they'd just be labeled salt box. The mainstream fact is that meat preservation was critical in the Middle Ages. Salted beef, dried fish, and smoked mutton filled larders far more often than fresh cuts. The quirky tidbit: some households even stored meat in barrels of ale, both preserving it and flavoring it at the same time, like the world's strangest marinade. Historians still argue whether peasants really ate much meat at all, or if it was mostly a noble indulgence, with archaeological digs showing animal bones clustered mostly around wealthy homes. Mini POV moment: a village cook rubs coarse salt into strips of mutton, sighing, "This isn't dinner, it's next February's dinner." By the middle of this salty truth, you remember our callback from the porridge bowl. Those watery stews made meat scraps stretch much further than roasting whole cuts. Joke number 2 drifts in medieval menu. Today's soup is chicken-flavored water, with a hint of last week's chicken-flavored water. Proof piles up in chronicles describing yearly slaughter days, communal events where cattle or sheep were butchered and salted, marking one of the few times villagers actually saw fresh meat in bulk. Historians debate whether fasting rules that banned meat for nearly half the year made people healthier or just hungrier. Either way, salted fish became a lifeline. Picture yourself biting into jerky so hard it could break a tooth, or a salt-cured mutton chop that's more salt than meat. Joke number 3 hits home. If medieval people had Yelp, half the reviews would read "too salty, 1 star." The punchline lingers: meat was never an everyday staple. It was a carefully preserved treasure, and when fresh meat did arrive, it wasn't gobbled in one sitting but managed like gold. So next time you complain about leftovers lasting 3 days in your fridge, remember your ancestors stretched one cow across an entire winter, probably wishing for Tupperware. When you think of medieval banquets, you probably picture noble lords biting into exotic fruits while peasants scrounged for crumbs. The myth being that only the rich ever tasted anything unusual. The story goes that commoners never had access to fancy foods, their diets locked into porridge, bread, and the occasional onion. But the truth is sneakier. Trade routes and festivals sometimes gave even ordinary villagers a taste of the exotic. Imagine a crowded fairground where spices, dried figs, and candied almonds sold alongside cloth and tools, and you realize that food curiosity wasn't limited to the castle walls. Joke number 1 lands fast. Medieval street food was basically the first food truck keks instead of tacos. You got honey-roasted nuts in a wooden cone. The mainstream fact: noble banquets certainly flaunted the rarest goods. Peacocks imported sugar, citrus from southern orchards, but townsfolk markets carried smaller shares of those same imports. The quirky tidbit: records show that apprentices sometimes pooled wages to splurge on gingerbread at fairs, a treat that tasted both spicy and sweet, and nothing like our modern soft cookies. Historians still argue whether such indulgences were occasional luxuries or a regular trickle into everyday diets, since household accounts show surprising amounts of sugar and spice even outside noble inventories. Minipov enters here. A young craftsman clutches a candied date at a midsummer fair, savoring it like it's the crown jewel of his week. Whispering to a friend, "Don't tell my master I spent my dinner money." By midstream, the callback from our earlier spice obsession rolls in you. Remember saffron clouds in smoky kitchens? But here's proof. Even average hands got to pinch a crumb of that golden dust on festival days. Joke number 2 tucks itself in. If medieval fair vendors had Yelp reviews, half would say, "Best gingerbread in town." But the line is longer than Lent. Proof builds further, with chronicles noting how towns smelled of roasting nuts and imported fruits when big fairs rolled through, tempting even the poorest to scrape coins for a taste. Scholars still debate whether these treats marked true economic mixing or just fleeting holiday indulgence, but the smell of clove and sugar in a busy square hints at more access than the myth allows. Now picture yourself chewing a sweet almond candy that sticks to your teeth while a juggler tosses pins nearby. Laughter mixing with spice smoke. Joke number 3 seals the flavor. Medieval dental planned, "Eat candied almonds if you like your teeth." The punchline glimmers. While nobles bathed in extravagance, commoners weren't shut out completely. They too had brief, flavorful windows into the exotic. And as you sink into this realization, you can't help but think our own snack splurges on chocolate bars aren't much different from a medieval apprentice's gingerbread gamble. You might assume that medieval people quenched their thirst with pitchers of crystal clear water, sipping it at mealtime like we do today. The myth says rivers and wells flowed with safe, fresh water ready for every cup. But here's the twist. Most people distrusted water, often considering it unhealthy, even dangerous, and turned instead to ale, beer, or watered wine as their daily drink. Imagine villagers, children included, lifting clay mugs of weak ale at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It sounds wild to modern ears, but it was their normal. Joke number 1 sneaks in. Medieval kids didn't ask, "Got milk?" They asked, "Is the ale ready?" The mainstream fact is that ale and small beer, low-alcohol brews, were staples because boiling the brew killed off many of the microbes lurking in water. The quirky tidbit: monks became expert brewers, not just for taste but because monasteries needed safe hydration, and some abbeys produced so much beer they supplied whole towns. Historians still argue whether water was truly unsafe everywhere or if cultural habit exaggerated the risk. Archaeological evidence suggests wells and springs often provided clean water, but social preference tilted toward ale. Minipov here. A tavern maid fills a mug, chuckling, "Don't worry, it's barely stronger than soup," as she slides it across a rough-hewn table. By now you recall the callback to porridge and gruel jest, as food was stretched and diluted. So too was drink, the ale thin and mild enough for all ages. Joke number 2 bubbles up. If medieval breweries advertised today, their slogan would be, "Drink responsibly," and also drink constantly, because it's safer than water. Proof deepens when you learn that in towns, water supply could be tainted by waste, making ale genuinely safer in crowded places. Scholars debate whether peasants in rural areas drank more clean spring water than urban dwellers, suggesting that the all ale, all the time myth may be exaggerated by city records. Picture yourself sipping a mug of weak beer at sunrise that tastes more like grainy broth than craft brew, and realize that hydration came with a gentle buzz. Joke number 3, foams over breakfast of champions. Try ale and bread porridge. The punchline goes down smooth, while water wasn't absent from medieval lives. Ale was the trusted daily drink, a social glue, and a survival strategy rolled into one. And as you ease into this truth, you see that their world wasn't so different from ours. We cling to bottled water brands. They clung to their local brew. Different vessels, same thirst. You probably imagine medieval people gathered comfortably around fireplaces inside their homes, cooking indoors with ease, safe from the elements. The myth tells you every meal was roasted and simmered in snug kitchens tucked away in stone houses, with only minor smoke in the air. But flip that cozy image and you find a darker truth. Cooking indoors was risky business. Sparks leaped from hearths, thatched roofs caught fire, and entire villages sometimes went up in smoke because dinner was on the stove. Imagine your stew pot becoming an accidental arsonist, and suddenly medieval life doesn't feel so homey. Joke number 1 catches flame fast. What's for dinner tonight? Depends if the house is still standing. The mainstream fact is that house fires were a constant medieval danger. Records show towns passed laws to restrict hearth use at night, or to fine families whose cooking fires sparked neighborhood disasters. The quirky tidbit: some cities even stationed firewatch patrols, medieval night shifts, that sniffed the air for smoke like human smoke detectors. Historians still argue whether open hearth cooking indoors was more common than outdoor setups. Evidence from rural houses shows many relied on detached kitchens or even communal cooking areas to reduce risk. Slip into a mini-pov here. A tired housewife stirs her pot nervously, flinching every time sparks snap, muttering, "I'd rather burn the stew than the roof." By mid-story, a callback arrives. Remember the smoky huts from our first myth? The very lack of chimneys didn't just sting eyes, it also stoked fires, proving once again that the dream of medieval kitchens was a bit of a nightmare. Joke number 2 smolders in. If medieval landlords posted apartment ads, they'd read, "Charming one-room cottage, includes built-in smoke machine." Proof builds from chronicles of entire towns losing hundreds of houses to cooking fires, forcing rulers to order new building materials like stone walls and tiled roofs for safety. Scholars still debate whether this shift was driven by genuine concern or just rulers sick of rebuilding towns every decade. Now, picture yourself stepping outside into the crisp night, holding your bowl of stew because it's safer than cooking inside, your breath mingling with the rising smoke from neighbors, all doing the same. Joke number 3 flickers out. Forget open-concept kitchens, these were open-air kitchens, whether you liked it or not. The punchline glows: steady medieval cooking wasn't the cozy indoor affair of modern kitchens, but a careful dance with fire, where survival sometimes meant cooking under the stars. And as you sink deeper into the thought, you realize that what we call inconvenience grilling outside in the rain was their everyday life. In your mind's picture of a medieval feast, you probably see everyone delicately twirling forks, clinking cutlery against pewter plates, like some sort of candlelit etiquette class. The myth insists medieval diners ate just like us, with neat little table manners and the same silverware you'd find in your kitchen drawer. But here's the twist. Forks weren't in common use for centuries, and most meals were tackled with knives, spoons, and most importantly your fingers. Imagine sticky stews dripping from hands, shared platters passed around, and the occasional greasy handshake before dessert. Joke number 1 wipes its hands right away. Medieval napkins. Oh, you mean the back of your sleeve. The mainstream fact is that knives and spoons were the standard tools. Forks only slowly entered Europe from the Byzantine world and didn't become widespread until the late Middle Ages. The quirky tidbit: some nobles resisted forks entirely, mocking them as silly little prongs and insisting God had already given humans perfectly good utensils, 10 of them. Historians still argue whether forks were a luxury fad among elites or a genuine shift in dining culture by the 15th century, with records showing mixed adoption. Minipov. A young squire sits at table, fumbling with a fork gifted by his master, sighing. This feels more like a weapon than a utensil. Midway through, you're reminded of the callback to trenchers. Those edible bread plates, finger food at its finest, where a knife was more for cutting chunks than for careful dining. Joke number 2 sticks to your hand. If medieval restaurants existed, the sign would read, "Finger-licking mandatory." Proof builds through banquet accounts, describing communal bowls of stew and roast meats carved at the table, where hands did as much work as blades. Scholars still debate whether the resistance to forks came from habit, practicality, or sheer stubbornness. Change is slow when half the room thinks cutlery is a passing trend. Now, picture yourself dipping your fingers into a shared platter of spiced chicken, quickly wiping them on your tunic while hoping nobody notices. Joke number 3 digs in. Medieval etiquette rule number 1: lick before you shake hands. The punchline lingers with a grin while forks eventually reshaped dining. For much of the Middle Ages, the table was less about polished manners and more about grabbing, tearing, and sharing. And as you ease deeper into this truth, you realize dinner wasn't just nourishment. It was a tactile experience, a feast where taste began at your fingertips. When you think about medieval food, you probably imagine a world without sugar rushes, where desserts were rare luxuries saved for royal banquets. The myth says sweets hardly existed, that peasants never touched sugar, and cakes were the stuff of fairy tales. But here's the flip. The medieval sweet tooth was very real, fed by honey, dried fruits, and later sugar itself, though used sparingly at first. Imagine candied almonds, spiced gingerbread, and honey drizzled over cheese appearing at feasts, proving that dessert wasn't just a royal perk. Joke number 1 sprinkles in right away. Medieval dentists must have loved sugar, kept them in business for centuries. The mainstream fact is that honey was the primary sweetener for much of the Middle Ages. And when sugar arrived through trade, it was treated both as medicine and luxury. The quirky tidbit: medieval cooks sometimes shaped sugar into elaborate sculptures, birds, castles, even knights on horseback that were admired before being eaten, making dessert part show, part meal. Historians still argue whether sugar filtered down to ordinary folk at festivals or remained tightly in noble circles. Since records show both market stalls selling spiced sweets and royal courts boasting sugar towers. Minipov here, a baker's apprentice, licks his fingers after dusting gingerbread with cinnamon, whispering, "One day I'll bake for the king, but for now, crumbs will do." By mid-moment, you remember our callback to fairs, where candied almonds delighted apprentices. The sweet world of medieval food wasn't empty. It was just hidden in smaller, occasional moments. Joke number 2 stirs the pot. If medieval cookbooks had recipe ratings, half would read, "Too much honey, not enough stew." Proof piles higher with banquet descriptions, where sugar mixed with meat dishes, not just pastries, creating sweet and savory pairings that sound trendy even today. Scholars debate whether this blend was an acquired taste or a necessity to stretch expensive sugar into savory dishes. But the love of sweetness is undeniable. Now picture yourself tearing into a slice of dense fruitcake. The figs chewy, the honey sticky, the spice warming your tongue as a minstrel strums nearby. Joke number 3 closes the bite. Medieval diet planet dessert first, because the stew might not show up. The punchline drifts gently far from being sugarless. Medieval tables made room for sweetness, whether in humble honey bread or elaborate sugar castles. And as your eyes grow heavy, you realize people 500 years ago shared the same craving you do when you sneak cookies before bed. The myth goes that medieval kitchens were strictly women's domains, with wives and daughters chained to the fire while men strutted about feasting. The story sounds tidy. Women cooked, men ate, but stir the pot a little, and you find something less rigid. Men cooked too, especially in monasteries, markets, and noble households where professional male cooks crafted entire banquets. Imagine burly monks bent over steaming pots, chanting prayers between stirs, or hired chefs sweating over spit-roasted meats in castle kitchens. Joke number 1 serves early medieval gender roles. More like whoever was closest to the fire got dinner duty. The mainstream fact is that while household cooking usually fell to women, men dominated the role of professional cooks in big kitchens, guilds, and inns. The quirky tidbit: some records describe male cooks so famous they were paid in silks and jewels, treated almost like medieval celebrities. Historians still argue whether these roles were drawn by necessity or prestige, since women clearly cooked for families, while men gained recognition in public kitchens. Minipov here, a monk ladling broth size. Brother Thomas thinks I'm on dish duty, but joke's on him today, I made the soup too salty. Halfway through this simmer, you recall our callback to the smoky Hutsto's family kitchens were indeed filled with women's labor. But beyond those walls, men often took charge of feeding whole communities. Joke number 2 bubbles up. Proof men cooked in the Middle Ages. Just check the banquet bills. No wife signed for 100 pounds of beef. Evidence piles higher with cookbooks attributed to professional male chefs in noble courts, recording elaborate recipes involving dozens of spices and intricate presentation. Scholars still debate whether women contributed more to recipe innovation behind closed doors, while men merely documented, or if the written record simply erased female cooks from view. Now, imagine yourself in a bustling castle kitchen, men and women alike, jostling over spits, pots, and trenchers, shouting above the roar of the hearth. Every hand vital to feeding a hall of hungry nobles. Joke number 3 slices in medieval kitchen motto. Too many cooks don't spoil the broth. They just fight over who gets the last spoon. The punchline lands gently. While gender roles existed, cooking was never exclusive, and when the fire roared, hands of all kinds turned the pot. As you ease back into the warmth of this thought, you realize cooking wasn't about who, it was about survival, community, and the hope the stew wouldn't burn this time. You've probably heard the romantic myth that medieval households wasted nothing, that every crumb and scrap was treasured with saintly efficiency. The picture suggests perfect recycling long before blue bins appeared on street corners. But tilt the bowl, and you'll see a messier truth. Scraps were reused, yes, but not always in tidy ways. Leftover bread might thicken soups, bones simmered for broth, and stale trenchers fed to servants, animals, or even tossed out the back for beggars. Joke number 1 drops early. Medieval trash can. Just open the window and aim. The mainstream fact is that recycling scraps was common out of necessity. Bones, rinds, and crusts went right back into cooking pots. The quirky tidbit: in noble houses, trenchers soaked with gravy were collected and redistributed to the poor, making table scraps part of charity as well as economy. Historians still argue whether this reflected genuine generosity or just a convenient way to dispose of leftovers without guilt. Mini-pov here. A tired servant gathers a pile of stale trenchers, grumbling, one man's plate. Midway through, you recall our callback to Brede's plates. Those edible bowls weren't always eaten by diners themselves, but by those waiting outside. Joke number 2 scrapes in reduce, reuse, recycle. More like reduce, reuse, re-stew. Proof simmers as account books list bones boiled repeatedly until they yielded no flavor, and even beer dregs poured into new brews, stretching supplies to the bitter end. Scholars debate whether this constant reusing meant diets were nutritionally efficient or simply masked scarcity, with some evidence pointing to deficiencies despite the ingenuity. Now picture yourself sipping thin broth, knowing the bones had already been used 3 times, while chickens outside pecked at stale bread meant to keep them fat for the next feast. Joke number 3 slides across the table. In the Middle Ages, leftovers didn't last long, mostly because the dog got there first. The punchline lingers softly. Medieval kitchens practiced recycling out of survival, not environmental virtue, and scraps formed a chain from nobles to peasants to animals. As your thoughts grow heavier, you realize their world wasn't so different from ours. We still argue over waste. They just couldn't afford the luxury of throwing much away. It's easy to think medieval Europe was one big uniform kitchen, everyone cooking the same stews in the same smoky pots. The myth says a peasant in France, a merchant in England, and a shepherd in Spain all ate more or less alike. But stir the pot, and you'll taste wild regional variety. Mediterranean households drenched food in olive oil. Northern cooks leaned on butter and lard. Coastal villages survived on endless fish, and inland farmers relied on rye or oats instead of wheat. Joke number 1 clatters onto the table. Travel tip: if you don't like the stew here, walk 50 miles and try again. The mainstream fact is that climate and geography shaped diets. Southern Europe leaned heavily on olives, grapes, and wheat bread, while northern regions leaned on root vegetables, dairy, and grains like rye or barley. The quirky tidbit: some regions brewed ale thick enough to chew, while others drank watered wine so light it barely counted as alcohol. Historians still argue whether these differences were celebrated as culture or endured as necessity, since choice was often dictated by what the land could grow. Mini POV flashes. A fisherman in a salty village slurps down yet another bowl of herring stew, muttering, "If I see one more fish, I'll grow gills." Halfway in, the callback from our earlier salt preservation story swims up you. Remember, meat salted for winter. But in coastal towns, salted fish became the main protein year-round, not just a fallback. Joke number 2, splashes in medieval diet plan: move inland if you hate fish, move south if you hate butter. Proof thickens through recipe manuscripts from Italy, with saffron risottos beside English recipes for meat pies, showing that medieval food was really a patchwork of cuisines. Scholars debate whether trade and festivals blended these tastes over time, or if strict regional diets held firm until much later centuries. Now, picture yourself traveling with a caravan, tasting spicy Spanish stews one week, then chewing dense rye bread in a German village the next, your tongue constantly adjusting to new flavors. Joke number 3, stirs the spoon. They say variety is the spice of life, unless you're stuck with boiled turnips all winter. The punchline settles warmly. Medieval cooking wasn't a single recipe repeated endlessly, but a spectrum of traditions, each shaped by soil, sea, and sky. And as your eyes drift heavier, you realize that while their kitchens were simple, their menus were anything but. These days, you hear people say medieval diets must have been terrible for health. All salted meats, greasy stews, and no fresh vegetables. The myth being that everyone dropped dead young with rotted teeth and aching bones. But lean closer, and you'll find the truth isn't so grim. While life expectancy was shortened by disease and war, many who ate balanced diets of grains, beans, vegetables, fish, and occasional meat lived surprisingly long, active lives. Imagine an elderly farmer walking the fields in his 60s, his wooden staff thumping the earth as he calls his grandchildren to supper. Joke number 1 nods. In medieval longevity, tip: avoid plagues, wars, and angry landlords. The mainstream fact is that peasants often consumed diets rich in fiber and plant-based proteins, which modern nutritionists might even praise. The quirky tidbit: archaeological studies of skeletons reveal strong bones with fewer cavities in some populations compared to sugar-fed modern diets. Historians still argue whether the so-called medieval diet was healthier for the body than ours, with debates circling around malnutrition during famines versus the benefits of simpler, less processed foods. Mini POV moment: a grandmother ladles out lentil stew, chuckling, "We may not have sugar cakes, but at least we have teeth to eat this with." By the middle of this truth, you recall the callback from Sweet Tooth Tales. Those rare desserts were joys, yes, but rare enough to keep cavities away, unlike today's candy aisles. Joke number 2 stirs in. Medieval dentists didn't hand out lollipops, probably because they wanted to keep their patients. Proof builds with records showing villagers lived well into their 70s if they survived childhood illnesses, an age many today would still consider long. Scholars debate whether this longevity was skewed by high infant mortality, dragging the average lifespan down, while actual survivors lived far beyond the myth of 30 years old. Now picture yourself at a wooden table, a bowl of beans, carrots, and bread before you. Your body fueled by earthy simplicity rather than processed snacks. Joke number 3, spoons in. Forget keto, try the medieval diet plan. Bread, beans, repeat. The punchline rests gently. Medieval diets weren't inevitably unhealthy. In fact, they may have sustained lives with unexpected strength. And as you sink deeper toward sleep, you realize our ancestors survived not by feasting daily like kings, but by finding health in modest bowls that carried them across decades. The fire's glow has softened now, and the journey winds into its last stretch. You've walked through smoky huts, peered into bubbling stone pots, gnawed on bread that doubled as a plate, and tasted spices worth more than gold. You've seen scraps recycled into new meals, sweets crafted into castles, and ale poured at breakfast because water couldn't be trusted. You've watched men and women alike stir the same pot, felt sparks threaten whole towns, and learned that forks were the new kids on the table, often mocked by those who preferred their own hands. The myth that medieval life was uniform, bland, or unhealthy has unraveled, and the proof has stacked as thick as a trencher under a stew. Joke number 1, flickers like a candle. If history teaches us anything, it's that salt was basically medieval Wi-Fi, connected everything. The mainstream fact that ties the knot is this: medieval food culture was resourceful, inventive, and far more diverse than legend suggests. The quirky tidbit: some festivals even hosted mock food trials, where bakers or brewers who cheated the public were pilloried with their own bad bread or weak ale justice served, literally. Historians still argue whether we romanticize or underestimate medieval food, but the debate itself proves how alive this kitchen past remains. Mini POV, one last time. A weary cook in a stone hall wipes sweat from his brow, watching a feast unfold, whispering to himself, "They'll never know how much work went into this meal." A callback simmers in you. Remember the smoky kitchens, the coughing children, the salty stews stretched for months, and the gingerbread crumbs on apprentices' lips. Joke number 2 settles in like spice in broth. Medieval recipe books could have been shorter. Every other line just says, "Add more salt." You recall again the trenchers that doubled as plates, the sweet towers of sugar, the endless fish suppers, and the fact that survival wasn't about banquets, but about making do. Proof from bones, recipes, chronicles, and fires all show a world both alien and familiar. Scholars still puzzle over details, but the laughter you've shared with them tonight proves food history isn't dry, it's sticky with honey, sharp with spice, and smoky with survival. Now close your eyes and picture that final scene: the fire dimming, the stew pot emptied, bread crusts stacked for tomorrow, and mugs of ale drained to the dregs. Joke number 3 drifts like smoke. Medieval leftovers, half for the animals, half for the neighbors, and none for you. The punchline lands softly, far from crude or flavorless. Medieval cooking was clever, communal, and filled with secrets that shaped centuries of taste. And with that, your journey through kitchens without kitchens draws to a close, leaving you full, not with stew, but with stories. The flames fade now, their glow reduced to faint embers, and the noise of markets, fairs, and feasts slips into silence. You feel the shift from noisy banquet halls to the hush of nighttime kitchens, where only a few coals stay alive, glowing faintly in the dark. The air is cooler, the smoke gentler, and the frantic stirring of pots replaced by a soft, steady hum in your mind. You're no longer standing in smoky huts or bustling markets. You're seated quietly, the weight of a wooden bowl resting in your lap. Though it's empty now, you can almost smell the faint sweetness of honey clinging to your fingers, the ghost of spice still warm on your tongue. But there is no urgency left, no rush of sparks, no clatter of spoons, no children coughing from the fire. Just a stillness, deep and safe. Imagine villagers sleeping around you, their kitchens quiet, their fires carefully banked. The scraps have been cleared, the trenchers stacked, the ale mugs empty. A dog sighs at the doorway. Somewhere outside, a night breeze brushes past the eaves, carrying with it the last threads of wood smoke, fading into cool starlight. Your breathing falls into rhythm with the world's hush. The long story of medieval kitchens without kitchens settles in your chest like a steady warmth. You have walked through myths, truths, and proofs, and now the only task is to rest. So let the lids of your eyes close, feel the softness of your pillow, and let the dream of distant fires lull you. You are safe here, far from sparks, far from smoke, held in the quiet glow of stories. Sleep well, traveler.